Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line and a single Ukrainian one. The Russians have advanced in the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region. The Russians have advanced within the city of Toretsk and the southern flank of Pokrovsk, as well as in the Vremevsky Luch direction. The Ukrainians managed to advance here in the western parts of the Zaporizhia region. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Russians have advanced to the north of the settlement of Kruklenkoe. With this, the Russians are moving towards Malaya Luknia from the northern flank. The Russians have previously attempted to push towards Malaya Luknia from the southwestern flank through Novoivanovka. With the recent capture of the eastern outskirts of the settlements, the Russians may attempt this again, with a pincer maneuver on Alexandria and Leonidovo, which will secure these positions to then push towards Viktorovka, combining that with an assault through the northern flank from Kruklenkoe. The Russians could do a pincer maneuver on Malaya Luknia. Combined with the Russian capture of Nadanov in the northeast, the Russians may look to advance along the railways towards Malaya Luknia from the northern direction as well, and advancing along the forest patches will allow for a flank from the eastern direction, and with that the Russians can attack Malaya Luknia from several directions, gaining control over these four settlements along Malaya Luknia and the river line. Will allow the Russians to gain full control over the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, threatening the entirety of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion through an open road between the Russian positions and Sucha from the western direction, as there are no significant fortifications or defensive positions that the Ukrainians have available in this northwestern parts of the Sucha direction. However, the Ukrainians have had a couple of months now where they've held these positions within the Kursk region to build up some fortified positions. With the use of what the Russians already had prepared, they'll be able to build some sort of significant defensive positions, which could significantly slow down any Russian push towards Sucha. Talking about fortifications in the Kursk region, according to recent arrests, it was reported that Kursk officials were accused of embezzling up to $150 million of funds that were supposed to go to building fortifications within the region. And this shows, again, another example of how corruption is rampant on the Russian side, just like it is on the Ukrainian side. We saw several examples of weak defensive positions which were repaired in the Kharkiv region on the Ukrainian side, and now we are seeing examples of the sort of corruption and embezzlement which is happening on the Kursk region, which allowed for the Ukrainians to launch their offensive into the Kursk region and make the initial strides. This is partially due to this corruption, which is now seeing the light of day. If we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that along the railway, which moves through the town of Malaya Luknia here in the northwest of Sucha, which is located on the low ground, the railway itself is located on the high ground, which means that one of the main axes of attack of the Russians during their recapture of the Kursk region will be through this railway, which moves through Malaya Luknia here in the northern parts and all the way through to the eastern parts of Sucha, which is also located on the high ground compared to this settlement itself, which is located at about 150 meters, with the high ground at about 153 meters. The river line in between is located at 139 meters. So there's not a lot of changes between the eastern and central parts, but the area in between is at a low ground between these two areas, central parts of Sucha and the eastern parts of Sucha. Moving towards the city of Toretsk, the fighting is now exiting the city in the northern direction, where the Russians have reached the outskirts of the settlement of Krymske, which is connected to Toretsk. It is sort of a smaller part, a district of Toretsk, but with its own name. And this area has the industrial zone, which the Russians are slowly moving towards, Gaining control over this industrial zone will allow the Russians to have full control over the main parts of the city, with the Russian control over the fortified positions in the eastern parts as well. We may see offensive operations by the Russians towards Krymsk to gain control over the industrial zone, and then moving along the railways towards Dashne, Delivka, and so on along the railways to gain control over these fortified positions and flank a lot of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in between Toretsk and Chesev Yar. The Russians may look to gain control over both cities to then connect the two along the railways ahead of Konstantinivka by capturing the settlements of Stupushki, Predeshina, and the settlements along the railways of Dashne, Delivka, and Alexandro Shulchine, which will cut off a lot of fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the canal, allowing the Russians to build up a significant portion of their forces in both of these cities and launch offensive operations towards Konstantinivka. And with this geolocated footage, we see that the battle over Krymsk has begun, which is the final of the three significant areas which determines the outcome of the Battle of Toretsk. Moving on to the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians have managed to enter Novo-Olenivka from the northern and eastern directions. The Russians have advanced along the main highway, along the forest lines towards the eastern outskirts of the settlement, and northwest of Pushkine, where they're now fighting towards the southern flank of Novo-Olenivka, where the objective is to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from the rear, taking advantage of their weak spots to then gain control over these positions as they fight over Novo-Olenivka. This assault is carried out from multiple directions, complicating the defense of the Ukrainian forces, and with the offensive towards the settlements, the Russians would open up a road towards Ukrainka from the northern direction, where they can repeat a similar process of attacking from multiple directions towards the settlement of Ukrainka, which then opens up to the next settlement. And as we can see, beyond Ukrainka and Novo-Olenivka, there's no fortified positions all the way down south towards Andrivka, and the settlement of Andrivka itself is also completely exposed from the northern direction, with no settlements, no fortified positions, nothing covering it from the northern direction, which means if the Russians gain control over these three settlements of Novo-Olenivka, Ukrainka, and Yasenove, then Andrivka will be completely exposed from the northern direction. The Russian will also be able to flank the settlements of Slovianka, Petropavlivka, and Shevchenko, while at the same time the recent Russian offensive operations following the capture of Selenivka towards Constantinople here to the west of Korokhove, combining that with an assault towards Andrivka in the northern direction, would allow the Russians to completely cut off any of the Ukrainian positions located within this pocket here to the east of these two settlements of Constantinople and Andrivka. And with the process of offensive operations starting here towards Novo-Olenivka, the process towards Andrivka has begun. While the fighting in the southern direction towards Constantinople has already begun, we see that the Russians have begun an operation not just to encircle what remains of Korokhove, but also to encircle everything in the northern and southern flanks of the settlement, to cut off a significant portion of the Ukrainian forces and to threaten the defenses of the Ukrainians here west of Korokhove in its entirety, cutting off completely the connection between Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka, with the fighting continuing in the northern flank of that settlement, where we see here in the direction of Novy Komar, which is one of the main supply lines of the Ukrainians that goes through this area, the Russians have completely cleared the northern parts of the settlement. This shows that the Russians have now secured Novy Komar and secured the northern flank of Velika Novosilka, combined with the recent advances in the southern flank as well. The Ukrainian supplies within Velika Novosilka and the surrounding settlements of Remivka, Neskushne, and Sorshene has almost completely collapsed, which makes the supply situation within Velika Novosilka extremely difficult. If the Russians now launch offensive operations towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Velika Novosilka, combined with assaults towards the western flank of Remivka, the Ukrainian forces within these settlements and defensive positions could be completely encircled and cut off from any escape or supplies or reinforcements arriving towards the village agglomeration. This spells disaster for the Ukrainian forces in the southern Donetsk region. The fact that the Russians are now threatening a complete encirclement of not just Korokhove but also the surrounding settlements, as well as Velika Novosilka and its surrounding settlements, which would collapse the Ukrainian defenses in the southern Donetsk region and leads to the Russians flanking several lines of Ukrainian defensive positions in the region. Finally, in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, the Ukrainians made a small advance along some forest lines southeast of Kamyansk. This is happening as this section of the front line has hardly moved for really a year and a half, and this makes the situation unexpected, but there's no indication that any significant movement is taking place in this direction either. In total, we see that the Russians are advancing all across the front line. The Ukrainians are launching some local counterattacks to regain some positions, improve their defensive positions, but no offensive operations on the Ukrainian side yet, despite Sersky promising a new offensive operation. The Ukrainian positions in the Kursk region are focusing on survival rather than expanding their offensive operations, confirming yet again that the entire objective within Kursk, whatever the objective was, it was not worth it. The Kursk region offensive has just been a much larger, pinky disaster for the Ukrainians, redirecting their own forces and resources that could have been used on defensive operations to then be wasted away in offensive operations inside Russian territory, which in the end did not bring any significant benefits. No significant forces were redirected. No significant changes happened to the front line in favor of the Ukrainians. Instead, it significantly sped up the Russian offensive operations in the Donetsk region, and the Ukrainians planning another offensive operation somewhere else could just add up to that and further spread out the already thinly spread out Ukrainian forces, while the Russians have superior numbers on the front lines. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.